Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. On the morning of September 6th, 2022, a missing person report was filed out of Brandon, Mississippi. The subject was Carson Reed Sistrunk, 24 years old. No prior arrests, no known enemies, no mental health red flags. He was reliable, stable, a quiet man with a routine life. Oil field technician by day, weekend fishing trips, and, more recently, a proud owner of a brand new 2022 Ford Raptor. What pulled Carson out of his pattern that night wasn't a party or a family emergency. It was a girl, someone he'd been talking to on Snapchat for less than a week. Her name, at least online, was Sierra's Milesex. Carson's last known activity was at 10:36 p.m. on September 4th. He sent a snap to a friend, a photo of his truck's dashboard with the caption, "Meeting her now. She better be real." After that, nothing. He didn't clock into work. He didn't respond to texts. His phone went dark by 11:05 p.m. There were no outgoing calls, no transactions on his bank card, and most tellingly, no activity on his Snap location. His mother called him 3 times the next morning. Voicemail. By noon on September 5th, his brother had already begun calling around. By the following morning, they went to the sheriff. Carson was gone, so was the Raptor. Investigators treated it as a voluntary disappearance at first. Brandon's not a place where people vanish, and Carson wasn't the type to raise flags. But 2 hours into the missing persons file, Deputy Henders from Rankin County Sheriff's Office made a call to Ford's Vehicle Services Department to access the Raptor's Ford Pass GPS trail. What came back was anything but typical. The truck had pinged at 2:57 a.m. on September 5th in a rural oil lease zone just south of New Habron. It was undeveloped land surrounded by dense brush and disconnected from main roads. It wasn't a place someone would stop unless they meant to go off-grid or meant to not be found. A search team was dispatched before dusk. They didn't need long. The truck was found behind an abandoned pumping station, partially concealed by overgrowth. The windows were closed, no obvious damage. The doors were unlocked. There was no wallet, no phone, no visible weapons inside. In the bed of the truck, beneath a standard-issue contractor's tarp, deputies located a deceased male, later confirmed as Carson Sistrunk, face down, arms bent beneath him, one shoe off. 3 entry wounds, one at the base of the skull, one through the left scapula, one through the lumbar. All fired from behind, no exit wounds. There were no shell casings recovered. The ground was hard-packed, disturbed only by the tire marks and a single set of partial footprints. Female, consistent with a size 7. Investigators noted the absence of drag marks. Carson hadn't been killed elsewhere and dumped. He was executed there, at close range. Mississippi Crime Lab's preliminary report confirmed the use of 9mm full metal jacket rounds. Based on powder stippling and trajectory, it was determined the shots were fired from less than 4 feet. The kill pattern was tight, methodical. There were no signs of a struggle, no bruising, no abrasions, no evidence of restraint. The victim had likely been seated or crouched when shot. Inside the vehicle, the cab had been wiped down. Not perfectly, not professionally, but with intent. Luminol testing later revealed traces of blood on the seatbelt buckle, under the rear passenger seat, and along the door panel's lower edge. Someone had attempted to sanitize the scene, but missed key areas. Areas investigators knew to check. Then came the next signal. On the afternoon of September 7th, Carson's Ford Raptor pinged again. The system triggered a geolocation log when the truck was restarted in Byram, Mississippi, 90 miles south of where the body was recovered. The movement was almost casual, as if whoever had the truck didn't realize the system could still track them, or didn't care. Sheriff's deputies tracked the ping to a gas station. Surveillance footage showed the Raptor pulling into a rear lot at 2:29 p.m. The driver exited, a young white female, late teens or early 20s. Slim build, dark hoodie, jeans. Her face was captured in profile as she walked into the store, stayed for under 3 minutes, and returned to the truck without making a purchase. The vehicle then turned north, out of frame. Still frames were distributed. By 8:50 p.m. that night, A deputy on patrol recognized the vehicle parked outside a duplex on Caston Avenue in Byram. He approached. The truck's engine was off. In the front seat sat the same young woman from the footage. She was alone, alert, and holding the keys in her lap. When asked whose vehicle it was, she answered, "Mine now." Her name was Sierra Jane Insco. She was 20 years old, no known criminal history, no open warrants, a former community college student, known to local law enforcement from a previous noise complaint in 2021, but nothing notable. She was calm. She didn't appear high. She didn't ask why she was being stopped. When questioned about the truck's ownership, she said, "Carson said I could use it." When asked when she last saw him, she shrugged and said, "Sunday night, I guess. He was drunk. I just drove off." Deputies noted a faint reddish smear on the truck's bed liner near the handle. It looked like old blood, but she claimed it was probably oil or something from work. When asked what Carson's last name was, she didn't know. When asked where he lived, she said, "Somewhere near Brandon. I wasn't paying attention." She was taken into custody on suspicion of possessing stolen property. The truck was impounded and processed by crime scene techs that same night. Inside the glove box, they found Carson's phone charger. Under the driver's seat, a disposable glove. On the back floorboard, a pink phone case without a phone in it. In the center console, wedged between receipts and a crumpled bottle of water, was a handwritten note. On it were the words, "Make it quick." Later, digital forensics would confirm that Carson's Ford Sync system had paired with a phone labeled SJ iPhone on the night of his disappearance. The Bluetooth connection lasted 32 minutes, from 10:43 p.m. to 11:15 p.m., during which time GPS logs showed the truck moving west out of Brandon, then turning toward the New Hebron lease site. The phone had never been connected to the vehicle before. It had no prior Bluetooth history with Carson. The logs did not suggest confusion. There were no U-turns, no stops for gas. Whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Sierra's phone was not recovered on her person. She claimed it had been lost 2 days ago, but couldn't explain why she hadn't tried to replace it or notify Snapchat support. When asked what her handle was, she couldn't recall the full name. "Something with smiles," she said. The investigation was no longer about a stolen truck. It was now a homicide, and this wasn't a case about miscommunication or panic. The data was too clean. The scene was too quiet. The timeline, uninterrupted. Carson had walked into the night expecting company. He didn't know he was being hunted. By the evening of September 7, 2022, Sierra Jane Insco was in custody, the Raptor was impounded, and the remains of Carson Sistrunk were secured for autopsy. The case had shifted from a possible missing person to a confirmed homicide with a suspect in possession of the victim's vehicle. But for investigators, possession was not proof. The job now was to connect Sierra to the scene, to the murder weapon, and, most importantly, to Carson in a way that would hold in court. The key to unlocking that timeline wasn't a weapon or a witness. It was Snapchat. Carson's last known communication had been a snap sent at 10:36 p.m. on September 4th, showing his dashboard. The metadata was already gone. Snapchat's default policy deletes unsaved content within 24 hours. And unless both users manually save a chat or image, there's no way to retrieve it through standard access. What did remain, however, was the connection log. The Mississippi Bureau of Investigation submitted an emergency disclosure request under the Stored Communications Act. Within 36 hours, they received a session history from Snapchat's legal compliance team. It showed the following. The account Shasa Sierra Smilex had exchanged 27 messages with Carson's account between September 2nd and September 4th. Only 5 of those messages had been saved. 4 on Carson's side, 1 on Sierra's. One of Carson's saved messages read, "What road is that again? GPS says it's gravel." The timestamp placed it 35 minutes before his phone went offline. The only saved message from Sierra's end was a reply, "Just keep driving. I'll be out there." This digital breadcrumb was admissible. It proved planned coordination in travel. It placed Sierra as the last known point of contact, and it aligned with the GPS movement of the truck recorded by Ford Pass and Sync. The trajectory was linear, uninterrupted, and direct toward the site where Carson's body was found. That alignment raised questions. In real-life crimes, random variables leave residue. Pauses, confusion, recalculations. This one moved with intention. In towns like New Hebron, that's not just suspicious, it's surgical. Detectives turned to Sierra's digital footprint. Her iCloud was subpoenaed. Though she had claimed to have lost her phone, Apple's device locator showed that her iPhone had last connected to Wi-Fi at 3:04 a.m. on September 5th. The location? An address in Florence, Mississippi, halfway between the murder scene and where the truck was recovered. She had deleted the Find My app hours later, and her iCloud backup had been disabled the week prior. Still, investigators retrieved a partial iTunes sync performed on September 1st from a desktop registered to Sierra's old roommate. That sync included 84 image thumbnails, most of them innocuous. But one stood out, a mirror selfie in a Ford Raptor interior. The metadata confirmed the photo was taken at 3:17 a.m. on September 5th. Carson was already dead by then. At the same time, a forensic technician analyzing the vehicle's infotainment system extracted device pairings. The SJ iPhone Bluetooth connection had uploaded partial contact data. Among them was a single first name, Carson, with no last name, saved manually. That contradicted Sierra's statement during her initial interview, where she claimed not to know his full name or details about him. The contradiction wasn't cosmetic, it was procedural. She knew who he was. She'd saved him. The phone was still missing. Meanwhile, the forensic team combed through Sierra's laptop and social media devices seized during her arrest. Deleted search history was recovered. Terms included, how to wipe GPS from truck, do bullets leave gunpowder on skin, and truck detailer near Byram open late. The bullet point that followed, typed at 2:01 a.m. on September 5th, simply read, "Don't forget the tarp." At this point, law enforcement had no confession, no eyewitness, no murder weapon recovered. But what they had was a digital trail showing intent, coordination, execution, and concealment, and they had motive. In questioning, Sierra mentioned that Carson had flashed his keys and talked big about the truck. It didn't seem significant at first, but her previous Google searches indicated otherwise. She had searched how to own a truck without buying it. The murder wasn't spontaneous. It was transactional. The preliminary autopsy report arrived September 8th. Carson Sistrunk's time of death was estimated between 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. The wounds showed no hesitation marks, no struggle. The angles were direct. The execution had been swift. That matched the Ford Pass trip log exactly. It also confirmed that Sierra had lied about Carson being drunk and handing her the keys. Toxicology on the victim was clean. No alcohol, no drugs, no defensive wounds. Only 3 precise gunshots from behind, all fired within a tight window. Investigators had enough to move forward, but one detail still bothered the case agent. The truck had been cleaned, but not well. The phone was gone, but not disabled. The body had been hidden, but not buried. The killer had planned everything, except how to disappear. That lack of follow-through raised a question. Was this the act of someone methodical or someone desperate? Carson's funeral was held privately on September 10th. His mother gave no public statement. His brother told media, he was quiet, but he was real, and someone took that away like it was nothing. Violence doesn't always come from chaos. Sometimes it moves with calm, calculated steps and leaves nothing behind except data. The scene behind the oil rig in New Hebron wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. Nothing at the site had moved since Carson Sistrunk's body was recovered on the morning of September 7, 2022. Investigators preserved the location for a full forensic reconstruction. The goal was simple: determine exactly how the shots were fired, from where, and what the evidence revealed about intent. The autopsy results had already given them part of the answer. Carson had suffered 3 gunshot wounds, all fired from behind. One had entered at the base of the skull, another through the left scapula, and a third into the lumbar spine. None of the bullets exited. There were no defensive wounds, no evidence of struggle, no sign he had tried to run. Mississippi State Crime Lab's ballistic reconstruction began with digital mapping. A 3D model of the vehicle was created using laser scan topography of the site and internal cabin measurements from the Raptor. Luminol trace found in the cab had already confirmed the driver's seat was the likely place where at least one shot was fired. The position of the blood traces aligned with an upright seated posture, consistent with Carson sitting in the front seat, likely unaware of what was coming. Trajectory rods placed through the recovered bullets in the victim's body were inserted into the physical raptor at the same angles and distances identified during autopsy. The results showed that the shots had been fired from outside the truck, specifically from the rear driver's side door. Based on angle and height, the shooter had stood with the door open, aiming down at Carson as he sat facing forward. There were no signs he ever turned his head. This pattern didn't fit with panic. It fit with control. Back at the site, investigators searched for casings. None were found. That fact wasn't accidental. Ballistics teams determined the gun used, a 9mm semi-automatic, based on bullet size and deformation, would have ejected casings sideways, likely to the shooter's right. But the ground had been swept. Investigators brought in ground-penetrating radar and fine-tooth metal detectors. Still nothing. The absence of brass suggested cleanup. Someone had picked up each casing or used a revolver-style adapter. But given the bullet type and wounds, a semi-automatic remained the only logical match. Whoever fired those shots had brought the weapon, used it precisely, and made an effort to erase the hardware trace. Tire marks told a secondary story. The tracks in the dirt matched the Raptor's exact tread and wheelbase. The truck had backed into the position where it was found. The tailgate had been down, a faint set of parallel lines, likely made by a tarp being dragged, extended from the rear of the vehicle to the edge of a flattened, grassy area 27 feet away. This detail was missed in the first pass, but revealed during the secondary survey on September 9th. What it suggested was chilling. Carson may have been killed away from the truck and then repositioned. Yet no blood was found in the grass, no visible staining, no splatter, and no drag marks consistent with a full body. The most likely conclusion was that Carson had been shot, then carried or walked, wounded, to the vehicle. But again, no trail, no blood drops. It remained unresolved. The partial shoe impression near the passenger side rear tire, previously dismissed, was re-examined. A forensic podiatrist confirmed it to be a women's size 7 athletic sole, bearing linear debris compression. It matched a style sold at a regional retailer 3 miles from where the suspect had been arrested. Receipts found during the search of the residence showed a cash purchase made September 2nd. The timestamp on that transaction placed Sierra Jane Insco at the register at 3:46 p.m., 48 hours before Carson disappeared. As the trajectory report was finalized, a critical piece of forensic analysis arrived from the vehicle's interior. Trace gunshot residue, GSR, found on the inside of the rear driver's side door. The sample was small, borderline degraded, but confirmed the presence of lead and barium particles. Combined with the trajectory mapping, it became clear the shooter had stood at that location and fired at close range, likely with the door partially shielding them. One question still remained. Why hadn't Carson fled? No signs of restraint were found, no zip ties, no bruises indicating a struggle or immobilization. Toxicology had already ruled out sedation. The autopsy noted that all 3 shots were fatal, but they were not instantaneously incapacitating. That detail mattered. Forensic pathologists introduced a possible answer: psychological compliance. The victim may have trusted the shooter, enough to sit still, enough to wait without resisting. Investigators brought that theory to Carson's phone data, which had finally been extracted. The GPS shutdown had occurred at 11:09 p.m., moments after the last Snapchat message had been sent. Forensics showed the device was powered off manually, not battery depleted. That timing correlated exactly with the Raptor's arrival at the oil lease site. Carson was still alive when he reached the location. His phone was shut off, intentionally. Then minutes later, he was dead. The pattern was no longer just suspicious, it was methodical. The investigation team reviewed all elements again. A linear drive route, a deleted digital trail, a passenger with a registered Bluetooth connection to the truck, a murder executed with no visible resistance and no physical chaos. It wasn't rage. It wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, right down to the footprints and the exit strategy. One more forensic detail came to light late on September 11th. A DNA swab taken from the inside of the Raptor's driver's side door handle returned a partial secondary profile. It didn't belong to Carson. It didn't match his family. It matched a known profile from a 2018 juvenile shoplifting case in Rankin County. It belonged to Sierra Jane Insco. From a procedural standpoint, the convergence of evidence was no longer theoretical. Trajectory, GSR, blood trace, GPS, Bluetooth, DNA. Still, no weapon had been recovered, no confession had been offered, and Sierra, when confronted with the forensic findings, invoked counsel and declined to answer further questions. In small towns, murders aren't just a matter of motive. They're a matter of disruption. The quiet predictability of Carson's world had been shattered by a process that felt premeditated but left behind fractures. The mistake wasn't in the act, it was in the data. Every device leaves a scar. Every movement leaves something behind. The weapon used to kill Carson's cis-drunk had not been found. After trajectory analysis confirmed the shots were fired from outside the vehicle, and gunshot residue placed the shooter near the rear driver's side door, investigators had narrowed the weapon type to a 9mm semi-automatic. But without the actual firearm, there was still a gap. One that could compromise the chain of evidence if left unresolved. Search teams revisited all previous locations linked to the suspect. The duplex in Byram where Sierra Jane Insco had been found with the Raptor was swept again, this time using K-9 units trained in firearm residue detection. They canvassed the home, surrounding structures, and adjacent drainage ditches. Nothing turned up. Next, attention shifted to the 22-mile stretch between the murder scene and the GPS ping in Florence. This included service roads, convenience store parking lots, and wooded patches. On September 13th, a search team identified a trash bag dumped behind an abandoned car wash. Inside, rubber gloves, a bottle of bleach, a burner phone box. Empty, and a folded microfiber towel with visible staining. No firearm, but the gloves tested positive for gunshot residue, and the towel returned a partial DNA match to Carson. Still, no gun. That missing item was more than symbolic. It was procedural. Prosecutors knew that juries respond differently when a weapon is physically presented. It grounds the narrative. The absence of one raises doubt, even when other evidence is overwhelming. Detectives returned to Sierra's browser data, this time reconstructing activity between August 28th and September 5th, using forensic software. The recovered history included pages on legal self-defense statutes, weapons registry loopholes, and detailed instructions on how to remove a serial number from a handgun using household tools. The final link visited on the night of September 4th was a video titled, "How to Wipe Gun Parts to Avoid GSR." The search warrant for her prior residence, a rented room in her aunt's house, produced an overlooked lead. In a bedroom drawer buried beneath clothing, investigators recovered a gun lockbox. Inside, nothing but an instruction manual for a Glock 19 and a receipt dated August 17th, showing the cash purchase of that same model at a private gun show in Hattiesburg. The buyer's name wasn't listed. Mississippi does not require private sellers to perform background checks or record personal details. The link to a Glock 19 was critical. Its ballistic profile aligned with the recovered bullets from Carson's autopsy. Lab techs confirmed that the bullet length and rifling marks matched known Glock characteristics. Without the barrel, they couldn't make a definitive match, but it was enough to bolster their theory. This wasn't improvisation, it was prepared. Meanwhile, the investigation team cross-referenced local surveillance footage between the time Sierra left New Hebron and when the truck pinged in Byram. In one gas station camera feed, time-stamped 4:42 a.m. September 5th, she was seen exiting the Raptor, wearing gloves and placing something small into a trash bin near Pump 6. The bin had already been emptied by the time law enforcement located it, but the footage was preserved and included in the case file. By September 15th, the physical search for the weapon was paused. Prosecutors had enough to file full homicide charges based on digital and forensic convergence. But the gun's absence would remain a procedural gap. That said, the lack of recovery didn't change the direction of the case. It only reinforced a pattern. Cover-up steps were attempted but incomplete. That inconsistency became a pattern of its own. Sierra had tried to sanitize the crime, cleaning the vehicle, deleting messages, wiping browser history, but none of it had been done thoroughly. She had knowledge, access, and intent, but lacked follow-through. This detail, subtle as it was, created a clearer psychological profile. Intent without long-term planning, execution with short-term impulse. Investigators noted this during case review. One senior detective phrased it plainly: everything was clean enough to fool someone casual, but nothing could fool the system. That gap between calculated and careless became central to the narrative being built for prosecution. The evidence didn't just show what was done, it revealed how much the person behind it thought they could get away with. Sometimes the value of evidence isn't in what it shows, but in how it was buried. The first formal interview with Sierra Janinsko took place on September 8, 2022, less than 24 hours after she was located behind the wheel of Carson Sistrunk's truck. At that point, the evidence was circumstantial but converging. Investigators had no confession, no weapon, and no eyewitness, but they had the timeline, the body, the truck, and the GPS trail that led to her front door. She waived her Miranda rights. The session was recorded. Throughout the initial questioning, Sierra appeared composed, even passive. Her answers were short, clipped. She claimed Carson had given her the truck, that she had driven away while he was sleeping it off. When asked where she last saw him, she said, "Some field out past Florence, maybe." That location didn't match. The actual crime scene was 70 miles from Florence. What stood out most wasn't just the inaccuracy, it was the consistency of her detachment. The phrases she used were vague, indirect. "I think" and "probably" punctuated nearly every response. But when the investigators introduced data points, sync logs, GPS history, bloodstain detection, her reactions changed. She didn't ask what they meant. She didn't deny their existence. She simply said, "I don't remember." That phrase became the pattern. When shown a still frame of herself entering the gas station in Byram, less than 12 hours after Carson's last known location pinged in New Hebron, Sierra blinked once and said, "That could be me." When asked why Carson's phone was never recovered, she said she hadn't seen it. When told her own iPhone had paired with his truck's Bluetooth system, she replied, "I don't know how those things work." The contradictions weren't loud, but they were layered. Each response was crafted to sound legally survivable, but each failed against verified data. Her biggest misstep came when she was asked about Carson's last name. She answered, "I never knew it." But investigators had already pulled a screenshot from her phone's gallery, a saved snap that read, "Carson S," below a Bitmoji icon. It wasn't a full name, but it was more than she admitted to knowing. At that point, investigators backed off. The strategy shifted. Rather than press for admissions, they built a case from forensic mismatch, testing her story against what the evidence refused to support. Over the following days, the interview team developed a behavioral profile based on the recorded exchanges. Sierra did not show signs of impulsive violence or mental illness. There was no psychological break. Instead, her posture was structured, controlled. She knew not to volunteer information. She answered only the question asked, and even then, only in the most diluted form. But if her words held back, her digital footprint did not. Data recovered from her previous devices painted a picture that her interview tried to obscure. She had searched for Ford Raptor resale value without title on August 30th. She had pulled up threads on how to disable Ford Pass tracking. On September 3rd, a day before Carson's disappearance, she opened an incognito tab to browse, "How long does GSR stay on skin?" This digital intent created a gap between what she said and what she'd prepared for. And that gap in homicide investigations is often where the weight of motive lives. By the end of the fifth day, prosecutors had enough to begin outlining a narrative for a grand jury. Sierra was not talking, but her browser was. Her phone was missing, but her cloud wasn't. Her denial was consistent, but so were her actions before the crime. There's a common assumption that motive must be emotional: rage, jealousy, revenge. But sometimes motive is transactional. It lives in practicality, in desire without empathy, indecision without restraint. What Sierra wanted wasn't hidden in her words. It was laid bare in her searches. By September 19, 2022, the Rankin County District Attorney's Office was prepared to move forward with formal charges against Sierra Jane Inscoe. The investigation, spanning 15 days, had produced no direct confession and no recovered murder weapon. But what it did have, and what prosecutors emphasized internally, was convergence. Dozens of separate forensic elements, digital records, trajectory analysis, and behavioral inconsistencies all pointed in the same direction. The case didn't rest on a single moment. It rested on alignment. The grand jury was scheduled for early October. In preparation, lead investigators compiled a narrative memo summarizing critical touchpoints: the GPS route into New Hebron, the time-locked Ford Pass logs, the autopsy wound path, the sync data showing Sierra's phone connected to the vehicle, and the purchase records tied to a Glock 19. Individually, these elements were strong. Combined, they became nearly irrefutable. Still, the question of motive remained. Without a personal connection to Carson, prosecutors couldn't argue jealousy or long-standing resentment. There was no text trail indicating conflict. No fight, no fear, no warning. That left only one viable theory: Sierra wanted the truck. The memo highlighted the search history that supported this claim. Terms like how to sell a vehicle without a title, can you erase GPS in a Ford Raptor, and how to make bleach clean blood were tied to her IP address. In cases like this, where emotion wasn't present, planning often was. On September 21st, Sierra was officially charged with second-degree murder and grand theft auto. The decision to file second-degree instead of capital or first-degree reflected a legal calculation. Mississippi law required proof of premeditation for a first-degree charge. While the evidence pointed toward planning, the absence of a recovered weapon and confession left just enough ambiguity that prosecutors didn't want to risk overcharging. Second-degree still carried the potential for life in prison. The charges were read aloud in Rankin County Circuit Court. Sierra appeared via video feed from the detention center. She said nothing. Carson's family was present. They had remained largely out of the public eye since his death, giving no interviews and issuing no statements beyond a brief acknowledgement of law enforcement's work. But the courtroom presence carried its own message: quiet, watchful, resolved. One of the investigators later said, "They didn't want a headline. They wanted clarity." And that clarity now rested on how the evidence was presented. In a case without a confession, every piece of material had to earn its place. Surveillance stills, browser logs, Bluetooth pairings, DNA swabs from inside a door handle. Even the torn receipt for a Glock, which didn't include a serial number, mattered. It showed intent. Intent substituted what Sierra refused to give. On September 23rd, a motion hearing reviewed the admissibility of digital evidence. The court allowed the metadata from Sierra's iCloud backup, including her deleted search history and timestamped photos, to be introduced. Defense counsel objected, but did not dispute ownership. They argued that without a murder weapon, the charges were highly circumstantial. Prosecutors didn't argue that point directly. Instead, they filed a supplemental brief documenting forensic matches from the trajectory modeling, which showed that the victim had been shot from a precise position, the same position Sierra had been seen exiting from in the surveillance footage captured less than 6 hours later. In true crime cases, it's rare for one piece of evidence to stand alone. What matters is how multiple sources confirm the same conclusion, and in this case, nothing contradicted the core sequence of events. Sierra met Carson. They drove to a remote location. He died of close-range gunshot wounds. His body was concealed. His truck was cleaned and driven away. His phone was never found, and she was caught driving the truck with blood still inside days later. From a forensic perspective, the absence of denial was its own kind of admission. Sierra never said she hadn't been there. She never claimed someone else committed the crime. She simply refused to say anything and let the data fill in the blanks. What stood out most at this stage wasn't what was presented to the court. It was what the prosecution left out. They didn't describe Sierra as evil. They didn't sensationalize Carson's death. They built the case the way he lived: steady, quiet, structured. Justice in this case wasn't about drama. It was about fact. By early October 2022, the case of State of Mississippi versus Sierra Jane Insco had reached a pivotal phase. Not in court, but behind closed doors. The forensic groundwork had been laid. The legal theory had been tested. The defense team now had full access to the state's discovery: GPS logs, trajectory modeling, Bluetooth pairing records, DNA swabs, deleted search history, and cloud-based metadata. And while no weapon had been found, the DA's office believed the weight of alignment made it unnecessary. The evidence spoke for itself. What remained unclear was how the defense would respond once confronted with the complete evidentiary package. So far, their posture had been minimal. Challenge the circumstantial nature of the charge, raise doubt about ownership of the digital traces, and emphasize the absence of a direct confession. But that strategy depended on jury psychology, not forensic contradiction. And by now, the contradictions were too consistent to ignore. The defense counsel filed a motion to suppress two key categories of evidence. One, the search history from Sierra's iCloud backup, and two, the Bluetooth pairing log from the Ford Sync system. Their argument was rooted in scope, claiming the search data was obtained outside of the original warrant's language, and the pairing log constituted an invasion of private association. The court denied both requests, stating that digital access was lawfully obtained and narrowly tailored. There was no violation. This left the defense with a narrowing set of options. Sierra had declined to speak further since her arraignment. The only record of her account remained the first interview, the one filled with omissions and inconsistencies. There had been no alternate suspect presented, no theory of third-party involvement, no counter-narrative that could explain why Carson Sistrunk ended up dead in a truck she was caught driving. It was during this lull that plea negotiations quietly began. These talks rarely appear in court transcripts, but they play a critical role in how homicide cases resolve, particularly those without confessions. A conviction at trial meant a likely sentence of life with eligibility for parole after 20 years. A negotiated plea could reduce that. For prosecutors, the choice was procedural certainty versus emotional cost. For the defense, it was survival. The first offer, extended by the state: plead guilty to second-degree murder and receive 35 years, with parole eligibility after 30. The offer included a stipulation of no media contact and a forfeiture of any future civil claims related to the investigation. Sierra did not respond. Her attorney requested additional time. During the same week, the prosecution received a new piece of forensic data: cell tower triangulation reconstructed from Sierra's missing iPhone using carrier-side metadata logs. While the physical device remained unrecovered, the data confirmed her device was within 2 miles of the new Hebron oil lease site at 11:08 p.m. on September 4th, precisely when Carson's Ford Pass GPS recorded the vehicle arriving. This new verification was added to the file and submitted to the defense. Inside the DA's office, the case file had now reached 642 pages. The lead prosecutor noted that, even without a confession, every movement, every deleted file, every change of story, they all converged on a single truth: Carson trusted someone who planned to erase him. That line was never said in court, but it was repeated internally to guide tone. This case, they insisted, would not be tried with spectacle. It would be tried with evidence. Still, the community was watching. Brandon wasn't a city that dealt with high-profile murders often, and this one, involving a seemingly random victim, a stolen truck, and a social media connection, had rattled assumptions. Safety in this context wasn't broken by violence. It was broken by deception. A young man had gone out to meet someone he barely knew. He didn't come back. The public wanted explanation. The courtroom would only provide resolution. Meanwhile, Carson's family remained quiet. They declined interviews, didn't speak at public events, and made no social media statements. But they attended every procedural hearing. They sat through pretrial motions. They reviewed redacted discovery when invited to do so. Their silence wasn't distance, it was discipline. By late October, the defense responded to the plea deal. They didn't accept it. Instead, they countered 25 years, parole eligibility at 15, with time served credited. The DA's office declined the offer. No further negotiation occurred. Sometimes the pretrial process is mistaken for inaction. But in truth, this stage defines the rest of the case. Every move is tactical, Every delay is calculated. And in cases where a life has been taken and no one is willing to explain why, the silence weighs heavier than any sentence. By late February 2025, the court calendar in Volusia County was full, but one name drew consistent attention: John A. Stagliano Jr., charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, Heather Stagliano. What had started with a single 911 call had evolved into one of Florida's most precise criminal proceedings in recent memory. The state had constructed a near-bulletproof case, a convergence of forensic science, digital evidence, and behavioral analysis. There was little left to debate. The defense, aware of what awaited at trial, opted to negotiate. Stagliano agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 40 years in prison, with a stipulation: no eligibility for parole before 35 years. It was not mercy, it was certainty. The plea ensured that Heather's family would never have to sit through a drawn-out trial full of graphic evidence and legal maneuvering. And more importantly, it ensured that Stagliano would face punishment that matched the severity of his actions. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no final statement. The judge read the sentence into the record. Stagliano stood silent, his face expressionless, as if already resigned to a life removed from the world he had tried to manipulate. He was 53 at sentencing. The terms of the plea meant he would be 88 before any possibility of supervised release. Realistically, the prison system would be the final chapter of his existence. For the prosecution, the plea represented a tactical victory. They avoided the risk of a mistrial, the volatility of jury emotion, and the toll of reliving trauma through testimony. For Heather's loved ones, it was something more complex. A legal resolution? Yes, but not closure. Her 3 sons, one biologically Stagliano's, the others Heather's from a previous relationship, had to reconstruct their lives without her. No sentence could balance that loss. The final report from the medical examiner was entered quietly into the record. Heather had suffered a single fatal gunshot wound. There were no defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. Ballistic matching, powder burn radius, and firearm residue all confirmed what the state had alleged from the beginning. She was shot at close range, likely while unaware or trusting. That detail, perhaps more than any other, captured the cruelty of the crime. There was no fight, no chance, just betrayal, point blank. In the months following the sentencing, several details emerged publicly, not from court testimony, but from state records and post-case interviews. Stagliano had used social media to fabricate a version of himself, spiritual, centered, morally grounded. But his private life was marked by jealousy, coercion, and a pathological need for control. Heather had tried to leave multiple times. Friends confirmed she often downplayed his behavior to avoid conflict. That reluctance to escalate, common in emotionally abusive dynamics, delayed intervention. One of the most chilling elements in the investigation remained how premeditation blended with presentation. Stagliano had reportedly prayed with the children just hours before Heather's death. Investigators believed that detail, while not legally damning, was psychologically significant. It painted a portrait of a man deliberately staging his image, even as he planned lethal violence. It was not a moment of rage, it was orchestration. Heather's name is now engraved in several domestic violence remembrance registries in Florida. Her case, cited in multiple victim advocacy training modules, is used as a real-world example of how abusers often do not look like abusers, and how spiritual manipulation can mask psychological control. This isn't just a story about murder. It's a case study in silence, image control, and missed intervention. The timeline was tight. Heather had made calls, had warned friends, had even reached out to legal resources, but the critical moment passed too fast. No one saw how quickly it would escalate. By the time law enforcement arrived, the outcome had already been sealed by a single trigger pull. As of June 2025, Stagliano remains incarcerated in a high-security facility in northern Florida. He has filed no appeals. There is no indication he will ever publicly speak about the crime, and perhaps that silence is fitting. After years of controlling the narrative, he no longer has one. I've shared this story not just to shed light on a chilling case, but to remind us all that behind the headlines are real lives, often silenced too soon. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Control doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like charm, faith, or quiet manipulation? If you or someone you love is walking on eggshells in a relationship, take that seriously. You deserve to feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually too. What do you think drives someone to cross the line from control to cruelty? Have you ever seen warning signs that others ignored? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if this video moved you, or even made you stop and think, drop a comment, let me know where you're watching from, or why this story stuck with you. If not, I'd still love to hear why. If you're new here and you care about stories that matter, that warn, and that teach, please consider subscribing to this channel so you don't miss the next case. Your voice adds to this community.